It was my time to reformat and reinstall. Hi everyone, Leo Notenboom here for askleo.com. For many years, the standard advice was to every year or two, take the time to literally reformat and reinstall Windows from scratch on your PC. The issue that it dealt with was what we lovingly refer to as software rot. The concept is that over time, be it due to installs and uninstalls, updates, changes, basically anything that is changing what's going on your machine, things would slowly destabilize. Windows was vulnerable to that. However, in recent years, honestly, that's not a recommendation I make at all. The only time I recommend a reformat/reinstall is if you're actually experiencing a problem. As it turns out, these days, Windows has improved to the point where its stability will typically outlast the life of the machine you're using it on. So for example, much like hard drives, much like SSDs, it used to be that their lifespan was fairly short. Now it's long enough that you can basically install an SSD, use it, and you'll find yourself replacing the machine before you actually need to replace the SSD. Same thing nowadays with Windows if you're an average Windows user. I, on the other hand, I'm not average. I'm not an average Windows user at all. I'm constantly tweaking things, installing things, uninstalling things, reinstalling things. You get the idea. I'm doing all sorts of things to my Windows installation. And as we'll see in a moment, I've got a bucket load of software installed that I use on a regular basis. And all of that can contribute over time to higher than average instability. And indeed, it was happening to me. What I had noticed over the past, I'll just say year or so, is that the machine seemed somewhat slower than I'd expected it to. The machine's 4 years old. It's been in service for 4 years. I'm very happy with it. But it had simply just gotten slower than I was really expecting it to. Then, a couple of weeks ago, I experienced a blue screen. And then a week after that, I had 2 more, which was unusual because for like the preceding 3 years, I hadn't experienced any, maybe 1. So clearly something was destabilizing. And since I have been using it for 4 years, there's a lot of stuff that has been installed that I have uninstalled. There's stuff that is installed that I really don't need and should uninstall. You get the idea. It really just boiled down to time for the nuclear option, time for a reformat and reinstall. Now, my initial approach was going to be to download the Windows Media Creation tool and create a bootable USB stick that I would then use to reinstall Windows from scratch. Great, I did that. And what it told me after it had gone through a couple of initial selections in the setup process, your machine doesn't support Windows 11. But it was running Windows 11 when I started. Something wasn't right. So I rebooted back into the existing copy of Windows 11, which was working just fine. And I ran the PC Health application, the thing that checks for compatibility with Windows 11. And sure enough, it said I couldn't run Windows 11, even though I was running Windows 11. The issue is that it didn't see a TPM at all, which is odd since I'm convinced that at some point I turned the TPM on in this machine. Fine, whatever. It wants a TPM, I'll give it a TPM. I rebooted into the UEFI BIOS and turned the TPM on, which is something that I think it might be unique to AMD processors, but it's simply a BIOS setting that you check, reboot, and all of a sudden you have a TPM. Rebooted back into Windows, ran the PC Health application, and it was happy. Said, yes, great, your machine is capable of running Windows 11. Wonderful. So I rebooted from the media USB installation stick. This machine doesn't support Windows 11. What the heck, right? I decided at this point, rather than continuing to beat my head against this specific process, I decided to take a different approach. Rather than trying to boot from something and install from scratch, I would use the Windows built-in tools. In other words, reset this PC, which is what I did. I ran reset this PC. I've got a video on it, how to reset this PC to reinstall Windows, and basically I just followed those instructions. Now, the first time, and yes, there were 2 times I ran this. The first time I ran this, I selected to keep my files. I figured that, sure, why not? Most of my data was on other drives, D, E, and G, but there's still some stuff on the C drive. Let's just keep that, see what happens. And sure enough, rebooted back into Windows, had a very nice working Windows 11, except it had preserved a few things that honestly I was expecting it to nuke. For example, I still had a user account. I still had customizations that survived the reset, things like my desktop background. Those were things that I didn't expect and things that I didn't want. And it also led me to wonder what else got preserved that I don't know about, that I didn't want preserved. Okay, fine. Reset PC a second time. This time, remove everything. And indeed, it went through the entire process again, this time setting it up as if it were a completely empty hard drive, which is exactly what I was looking for. So we reboot into the correct setup experience. It runs OOBE, the out-of-box experience. I chose to use my Microsoft account as the sign-in for this machine. I turned off all of those options that send data back to Microsoft. You know, the various pieces of data, the custom advertising stuff, all of that. I just turned it off. I'm not generically opposed to that, but since I use this machine all the time, I wanted as little of that happening, taking resources away from me as possible. And I went ahead and linked Windows to my phone for the first time. This is simply because I wanted to test that experience. I've not done it in the past, and they offer it as you set up Windows, so I went ahead and did that. And so far, that at least has been fine. Now, great. I've got Windows reinstalled truly from scratch. It is a pristine copy of Windows. I mentioned that I have other drives. I've got the C drive, which is where the system is installed. I have the D drive, the E drive, and a G drive. D is 2 terabytes of SSD. It's where I keep things like my virtual machine images, the videos that I'm working on, and so forth. The E drive is an 8 terabyte internal hard disk that contains things like my entire 2.7 terabyte Dropbox and my 0.5 terabyte OneDrive and my Google Drive and my Proton Drive. What I noticed, though, was that the drive letters had not been assigned the same way. In other words, the drive that had been my D drive was now my E drive, and vice versa. So the very first thing I had to do, because I needed the drive letters to stay the same, was to go into Disk Manager and essentially reshuffle the drive letter assignments so that they matched the way that the machine had been configured before. At this point, it was time to start playing with applications. The first thing I did is not really an install, but I decided this time around to go ahead and let Edge be my default browser. So I fired it up and answered a few of its configuration questions. But then I also signed in to my profile, my Edge profile, using my Microsoft account. What that allowed me to do is instantly get all of my other settings, my extensions or add-ons that I had configured in other copies of Edge on my other machines. So at that point, once it was synchronized, yeah, Edge was just ready to work. It had all of my extensions, my configurations, and so forth. Now, there is one setting that I will caution you about, and that is simply this. Edge will offer to bring in browsing data from other browsers, like Chrome or Firefox or whatever. Be clear, this is not a one-time operation. It will regularly, periodically do this. So only say yes if that's really what you want. I don't. So I say no. I don't want it to import any of the data from my other browsers because I've got separate browsers for specific reasons that I don't want them to necessarily cross-pollinate. Okay, time for some real application installations. Now, In order to keep this video manageable, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with each one, but I am going to run down what I've installed, and we'll be alternating between application installs and some tweaks I've been making along the way. I started with Obsidian. Obsidian is my note-taking app that I was using to basically take the notes that would turn into this video and the companion article. 1Password, because of course, one of the very first things I would need are my passwords. Cryptomator, same thing. I've got secure data in my Dropbox files that I wanted to be able to access. Gmail, technically not an installation, but it is key in order to basically respond to the inevitable authentication requests that were going to come from the various accounts and software that I was going to be installing in the future. My first round of tweaks were basically annoyances that I needed to fix right away. For example, Windows chose the wrong default sound device, so I had to change it from my headphones to my speakers. I have a second monitor, and Windows put it off to the left, I think it was, or maybe the right. I need it on the top. That's where I moved it to. I also at this time chose to get a bigger mouse pointer size because it's a big screen. It was kind of hard to see sometimes. I changed a setting to turn off the backup feature. This is very frustrating to me because OneDrive will often come with the backup feature, what I consider to be a broken backup feature, turned on by default. So check your OneDrive and make sure it's set the way you want it to be set. I want it off. And then finally, I changed the location of my OneDrive folder. Remember, I said that my E drive, that 8 terabyte internal hard disk, had the OneDrive folder on it. I simply pointed OneDrive at that folder, and it didn't have to download or upload anything, although it did spend a fair amount of time at that point, essentially scanning and indexing the data that was in that folder. Next up was installing Dropbox. Dropbox, again, like OneDrive, I rely on heavily in my day-to-day. This was kind of disappointing because, like OneDrive, the Dropbox folder, all 2.7 terabytes of it, was on my E drive. But for whatever reason, this has worked for me in the past, but this time I could not get Dropbox to actually recognize that there was already a Dropbox folder there, full of the data that it was looking for. So I basically threw up my hands and said, fine, download it all from scratch. That's okay. 2.7 terabytes. I've got a fairly fast internet connection. And in theory, on my internet connection, the maximum I could expect would be about 6 hours. Theoretical maximum. That never, ever happens because of overhead and a few other things. Honestly, I would have been happy with like 12 hours to get everything downloaded. However, after watching it progress for a while, it was clear that it was going to take days. That was disappointing. And that actually was an early sign of a problem that I'm not going to talk about in this article, but there will be a follow-on article that discusses a very specific problem that this entire process uncovered. I installed Google Chrome. I installed Google Chrome because I use that for my business, while I use Edge for my personal and default activity. I also use this as an opportunity to organize the taskbar notifications in the lower right. At this point, there were things there that I didn't want to see, some things that were hidden that I did want to see. Get the idea. It's a simple thing to clean that all up. I installed sysinternal tools. I use those fairly heavily. Most often, Process Explorer, but there were a number of other tools that are just nifty to have as part of that package. Hyper-V is the technology that is in Windows 11 Pro that basically enables virtual machines. And as you know, I use virtual machines quite heavily. This wasn't so much an install as it was going into the Windows features list and turning it on. DaVinci Resolve is the video editing tool that I'm using of late. And honestly, it's one of the reasons that I did this entire clean install, because it's one of the applications that was feeling very pokey. I installed it, did a couple of quick tests, nothing truly definitive, but it definitely felt faster than it had in the past. Macurim Reflect, of course, I installed my backup software, did a backup right then and there, an image backup of the entire machine so far, and I also then configured my standard monthly full daily incremental backup regime, all going to that external G drive. I installed Thunderbird. the desktop email app. I have some of my email segmented out into different email addresses. For example, when I sign up to newsletters, I don't use my primary address, I use a separate one. It's that separate one that I then use in Thunderbird so I can just read all of my newsletters and that kind of stuff. They're not expecting to have any true correspondence come through that particular address. At this point, I broke for lunch, and then when I came back, the screen was black. So that reminded me I had to change a couple of things. In the power settings and in the screensaver settings, I set things up so that the machine would never sleep if it was connected to power. It's a desktop machine, it's always connected to power. That the screen would be turned off after 1 hour of inactivity, fine. And I double checked to make sure that no password would be required when I brought the screen or reactivated the screen after some period of inactivity. That's usually a screensaver thing. I just made sure that that wasn't in place. More applications. Time to get to work. Snagit, my screen capture utility that I've been using for, gosh, decades. Pro Writing Aid. Essentially, it's equivalent to Grammarly that you may have heard of, but it's less expensive and, in my experience, pretty good. Foxit Reader. One of the things that I'm doing in this reinstallation is divesting myself of Adobe products, basically cutting that cord. That implied, of course, I needed a replacement PDF reader. I installed Discord for the askleo Discord group, as well as some of the other groups that I am a member of. Slack, same idea. I'm a member of a couple of Slack groups. WhatsApp, I communicate with a number of people using WhatsApp. Facebook Messenger, same. Telegram, same. Clipboard help and spell. I realized that Windows V gives you clipboard history and a number of other nice things. I've been using clipboard help and spell for quite some time, and I find it just has some features that I feel more comfortable with that I actually really like. GVim, or VI for some of you, is my text editor of choice, mostly because not only is it powerful, if somewhat arcane, it's also present on every platform that I use, Linux, Mac, and Windows. And Chrome Remote Desktop. I use Chrome Remote Desktop to access some of those other machines that I use. Time for some more tweaks. I changed the default search engine in my browser to kaji.com. I've got an article on why I'm not using Google Search these days, and I'm finding Kaji to be quite useful. Since I have Dropbox and OneDrive on a non-default drive, on an E drive, I would like to be able to access them from a consistent location across all of my machines. So what I do is I set up a hard link that essentially points C:\Dropbox to wherever the actual Dropbox happens to be located. In my case now, on this machine, that's E:\Dropbox. But the bottom line is that across all of my machines, I can always access Dropbox through C, even though it might be located somewhere completely different. Same thing for OneDrive. Now it was time to have some fun uninstalling things. I uninstalled Cortana, Maps, Media Player, Teams, To Do, Movies and TV, News, OneNote, Paint, Photos, Power Automate, Skype, Solitaire and Games, Sound Recorder, Sticky Notes, Weather, Xbox, and Xbox Live. I also went into the optional Windows features and turned off Media Player Legacy. All of those are things that I don't use, don't need them taking up space on my machine, and if I ever change my mind, they're easy enough to get back, usually through the Microsoft Store. More applications. I installed my Kindle application. I installed Calibre, which is another ebook management application. I installed Putty, the remote console, remote command line that I use to get to my servers. I installed XNView MP, which is my current image viewer of choice. I installed Microsoft Office, technically Microsoft 365, because I use Excel and Word quite heavily. I installed OBS, Open Broadcaster software. That's the software that I'm using right now, actually, to record this video. I installed Crisp.ai. That is an audio processing tool, again, using it right now, that removes noise and generally makes the echo in this room somewhat less, and is actually capable of removing corgi barks. I installed Zoom, the video conferencing tool. I use it for a variety of things, including recording the TEH podcast. Python is the scripting language that I tend to use these days on this machine. I installed Affinity Photo. That is the replacement I'm using for Photoshop, since I'm not anymore in the Adobe ecosystem. I installed Brave browser. This will be the browser that I use for my nonprofit efforts. VLC is the media player that I use and recommend. Spotify, because I like to listen to music. Unify is an app for managing the mesh network that I run here at home. Mountain Duck is the remote access tool that allows me to mount the hard disk of my remote servers, like the one hosting askleo.com, as if it were just another drive on my Windows machine. MySQL Workbench, the databases behind all of my sites, all of my WordPress sites, are MySQL. It's very handy then to have a tool here on my PC that allows me to essentially manage MySQL directly at a low level. Time for some more tweaks. I set up a local account for these machines. That's the local account I have on every machine that I use to make networking a little bit easier. In that same vein, I then also remembered I needed to change the work group for this machine to my standard work group that I use here at home. Next up, I changed the path environment variable to include a couple of folders in which I have tools, standard set of tools that I carry with me from place to place. That makes running those tools significantly easier. I just type the name of the tool and Windows locates the folder containing the tool by running down the path. And at this point, it was time to clean up the start menu a little bit because there was stuff on the start menu that honestly I wasn't interested in. It was just taking up space. So that's pretty much where I'm at right now. But I'm not done. Here are some things coming up in the future. Things I actually expect to install as soon as I need them include Audacity, the audio editor, Google Drive, Proton Drive, and a set of apps from Topaz Labs. These are AI photo processing apps that essentially do things like remove noise and increase size and so forth. There's some applications that I'm not sure about yet. For example, Start 11 is what I had been using to manage my start menu. It allowed me to have a Windows 10 style start menu even in Windows 11. Right now, deciding to see if I can live with the Windows 11 start menu. We'll see how it goes. Power Toys. This one surprises me, but the feature that I use the most in Power Toys, having to do with window layout, is actually kind of sort of very similar to a new feature, a default feature in Windows 11. So I'm basically seeing if that will do for me. If I end up coming up with something else that Power Toys would solve for me, of course, I'll install it right away. iCloud. I don't use iCloud that much, and I decided that even though I do use it, I didn't need to have the app installed. Explorer 2 is a dual pane Windows File Explorer replacement. I love the tool, I've been using it for years, but I decided again for this installation, I'm going to see how well it works to just live with Windows File Explorer. ChatGPT and Canva. These are two applications that actually I use all the time. In fact, I've already used them. They each have applications that can be installed, but those applications really don't offer a tremendous amount of value beyond what you would get by simply visiting their website and signing in. So I'm electing to just use them through my web browser for now until I find a reason not to. That's it. That's where I'm at. This isn't one of those videos where I have a suggestion for what you should do because of what I have done. It's more an example of here's what I did, here's why I did it, which perhaps would be useful to you. Here's this long list of applications that I've installed or may install that might be informative to you, might give you some ideas, give you a glimpse behind the scenes as to just exactly how I use my PC and what I do with it every day. I alluded to there being a story to come, and there is. In a couple of days, I'll have another video and an article discussing exactly a problem that this entire process uncovered. But for now, I've got a great, clean, working Windows 11 system, and now you know what it takes. For updates, for comments, for links, especially links to every application that I've talked about so far, visit askleo.com/170574. I'm Leo Notenboom, and this is askleo.com. Thanks for watching.